Have you ever wondered if there was a woman before Eve? A figure so powerful, so rebellious, that she was erased from the pages of Scripture itself. Was she truly Adam's first companion, created equal and defiant? To question the very foundations of creation itself, we're going to travel back through millennia of human storytelling. From the dusty tablets of ancient Mesopotamia to the mystical writings of medieval Jewish scholars. Because we're about to embark on a journey that will take us from the very dawn of creation to the cutting edge of contemporary thought. Are you ready to meet the woman who dared to defy the divine order? Its massive walls rising from the desert sands. Its ziggurats reaching toward the heavens like stone fingers grasping for the divine. In the scribal schools of this mighty empire, they were believed to be the restless spirits of young women who had died before marriage, before motherhood, before they could fulfill what society deemed their natural purpose. Denied the opportunity to bear children in life. Among the ancient Sumerians, in one of humanity's earliest recorded epics, we encounter a tale that some scholars believe contains the very first literary appearance of the figure who would become Lilith. This is the story of Inanna and the Holupu tree, a myth that reveals the cosmic struggle between order and chaos, between civilization and the wild forces that threaten to tear it apart. They returned as vengeful spirits to steal the children of others. Can you imagine the psychological weight of such a belief? The way it would transform every shadow in a nursery into a potential threat, every strange sound in the night into a harbinger of doom. On clay tablets pressed with cuneiform script. As empires rose and fell, as peoples migrated and cultures merged, the legend of these night demons spread like wildfire across the ancient world. The Assyrians knew them, the Hittites feared them, and eventually, they found their way into the consciousness of the Hebrew people. Each culture added its own flavor to the legend, its own interpretation of what these creatures represented and why they existed. We find the earliest whispers of creatures that would one day coalesce into the legend of Lilith. These weren't yet the stories of Adam's first wife, but something far more primal, far more terrifying. Are you prepared to question everything you've been taught about the beginning of humanity? Then let's begin. Striking at the very moment when life was most precious and most fragile. In an age when childbirth was a journey into the valley of death, when infant mortality rates were staggeringly high, these demons represented humanity's deepest fears, given form and substance. We're going to meet a woman whose very name strikes fear into the hearts of mothers, before Adam and Eve became household names. There existed a vast and mysterious world of ancient mythology that stretched across the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia. This was a realm where gods walked among mortals, masculine spirits of the night, and their feminine counterparts, the Lilith. These weren't merely monsters conjured from imagination. They were believed to be real, tangible threats that haunted the vulnerable moments of human existence. They were the demons of the in-between, the creatures that emerged from the shadows when the natural order was disrupted, when life hung in the balance. Where demons lurked in every shadow, and where the boundary between the divine and the terrifying was razor thin. It was in this primordial landscape of human imagination that the figure we now know as Lilith first began to take shape, whose legend has inspired both terror and admiration across cultures and centuries. We're going to uncover the shocking truth about her supposed relationship with Adam, her dramatic confrontation with God himself, and her ultimate transformation from divine creation to demonic force. Then type 77 in the comments below. This is a narrative that has exploded into modern consciousness, that has been embraced by feminist movements, that has challenged traditional religious authority, and that continues to spark fierce debate among believers and scholars alike. The question isn't just who Lilith was, but why her story matters now more than ever. And make sure you're subscribed with that notification bell turned on, because this journey into the shadows of history is going to be unlike anything you've ever experienced before. Or is she nothing more than a carefully crafted myth, a cautionary tale designed to warn against the dangers of female rebellion? Tonight, We're going to dive deep into one of history's most controversial and mysterious figures. And I promise you, what we uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the beginning of human existence. Her name whispers through the shadows of ancient texts, dances on the edges of forbidden knowledge, and haunts the deepest corners of human imagination. She is Lilith, the woman who supposedly walked with Adam before Eve ever drew breath, the first wife who refused to submit, the mother of demons who chose exile over obedience. But here's the question that has plagued scholars, theologians, and seekers of truth for centuries. Was Lilith real? If you're ready to explore the forbidden corners of ancient mythology, let me paint you a picture of what we're about to discover together. But this isn't just an ancient story gathering dust in forgotten libraries. So settle in. Long before the familiar stories of Genesis were written, picture, if you will, the ancient city of Babylon. The ancient Babylonians spoke of demons called Lilith. But what made these demons so terrifying wasn't just their supernatural power. It was their specific target. They preyed upon pregnant women and newborn children. The ancient texts tell us that these Lilith demons were born from tragedy itself. But the story doesn't end in Babylon. Now here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. The tale begins with Inanna, the goddess of love and war, discovering a magnificent halupu tree growing on the banks of the Euphrates River. This wasn't just any tree, but a cosmic symbol, a representation of the axis that connects earth to heaven. Inanna, seeing its potential, transplants this tree to her sacred garden in the city of Uruk, intending to craft from it a throne and a bed, symbols of her divine authority and power. But as the tree grows and matures, something unexpected happens. 3 creatures take up residence within its branches and roots, preventing Inanna from claiming her prize. There's the serpent who knows no charm, a creature of primordial chaos that cannot be controlled or tamed. There's the Anzo bird, a storm demon that nests in the crown of the tree. And there, in the trunk itself, dwelling in the very heart of the tree, is a creature known as Ki-Il-Lil-K, a name that some scholars translate as the young woman, the maiden of desolation. This maiden, this Ki-Il-Lil-La-K, is believed by many to be the earliest literary ancestor of the Lilith we know today. She represents the untamed feminine, the aspect of womanhood that refuses to be domesticated, that chooses the wild places over the ordered spaces of civilization. When the hero Gilgamesh arrives to help Inanna reclaim her tree, he strikes down the serpent with his mighty axe. The Anzo bird flees to the mountains with its young, but what happens to Ki-Il-Lil-La-K is particularly significant. She doesn't fight, she doesn't negotiate, she doesn't submit. Instead, she demolishes her own dwelling place and flees to the wild, uninhabited places of the earth. This act of self-destruction, rather than submission, becomes a recurring theme in the Lilith legend. She chooses exile over surrender, wilderness over domestication, freedom over security. But why does this ancient Sumerian tale matter to our understanding of Lilith? Because it establishes a pattern that will echo through thousands of years of human storytelling. Here we see the archetypal figure of the woman who refuses to be contained, who chooses the dangerous freedom of the wilderness over the safe constraints of civilization. This isn't yet the story of Adam's first wife, but it's the foundation upon which that story will eventually be built. The Sumerian tale also introduces us to a crucial concept that will become central to the Lilith legend: the idea that certain beings exist in the liminal spaces, the boundaries between order and chaos, between the sacred and the profane. Ki-Il-Lil-Laki dwells in the tree that connects earth to heaven, but she also represents the forces that prevent divine order from being fully established. She is both necessary and dangerous, both creative and destructive. As we move forward through the centuries, watching the evolution of these ancient stories, we begin to see how the figure of Lilith emerges from this rich tapestry of Mesopotamian mythology. She carries with her the memory of the Lilith demons, the echo of Ki-Il-Lil-La's rebellion, and the primal fear of the untamed feminine that has haunted human consciousness since the dawn of civilization. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. It doesn't stay buried in ancient texts. Instead, it begins to evolve, to transform, to adapt to new cultures and new concerns. The Babylonian demons become Jewish folklore, the Sumerian maiden becomes a biblical figure, and the ancient fears of night-stalking spirits become a complex theological debate about the nature of creation itself. What we're witnessing isn't just the transmission of a story from one culture to another. We're seeing the birth of a myth that will challenge the very foundations of religious authority, that will question the established order of creation, and that will ultimately become a symbol of female empowerment in ways that its ancient creators could never have imagined. The transformation of Lilith from ancient demon to Adam's first wife is a journey that spans millennia and crosses countless cultural boundaries. It's a story of how human imagination takes scattered fragments of fear and folklore and weaves them into narratives that speak to the deepest concerns of each generation. And as we'll discover, this transformation is far from complete. The Lilith of ancient Mesopotamia is just the beginning of a legend that will continue to evolve, to surprise, and to challenge us even today. So as we prepare to follow this legendary figure through her next transformation, as we watch her move from the realm of demons into the pages of sacred text, remember that we're not just tracing the evolution of a myth. We're exploring the very foundations of how humans understand themselves, their relationships, and their place in the cosmic order. The woman who began as a night demon in ancient Babylon is about to become something far more complex, far more controversial, and far more relevant to our modern world than anyone could have predicted. The stage is set, the ancient foundations are laid, and now we're ready to witness one of the most dramatic transformations in the history of human storytelling. Are you ready to see how a Mesopotamian demon becomes the first woman to challenge the divine order itself? Now we must journey from the shadows of ancient Mesopotamia into the sacred halls of Hebrew scripture, where we encounter the first and only explicit mention of Lilith in the entire Bible. But here's what will shock you. This appearance is nothing like the stories you may have heard. There's no Adam, no Garden of Eden, no dramatic confrontation with God. Instead, we find something far more mysterious, far more haunting. Turn with me to the book of Isaiah, chapter 34, verse 14. The prophet is delivering one of the most terrifying judgments in all of Scripture, a divine oracle against the kingdom of Edom. Picture this scene. God's wrath has been unleashed. His sword drips with blood, and the very land itself has been transformed into a wasteland where nothing good can grow. The cities lie in ruins. The people have fled or perished, and now in this desolate landscape, something extraordinary happens. The prophet begins to list the creatures that will inhabit this cursed land. Wild animals, desert creatures, beings that represent the complete breakdown of civilization and order. And there, nestled among the jackals and hyenas, among the goat demons and screech owls, we find a single Hebrew word that will echo through centuries of human imagination: Lilith. There too the Lilith shall repose and find herself a resting place. Just one mention, just one verse, but oh, what a verse it is. The Hebrew text treats this creature as if she needs no introduction, as if every reader would immediately understand who and what she is. There's no explanation, no description, no backstory. She simply appears in this catalog of desolation as naturally as the wind appears in a storm. But here's the crucial detail that most people miss. The way Isaiah uses this word suggests that Lilith wasn't some obscure demon known only to scholars and priests. She was a household name, a figure so familiar to his audience that mentioning her required no more explanation than mentioning a lion or a bear. The terror she represented was immediate, visceral, understood at the deepest level of human consciousness. Think about what this means. Here we have a prophet of God, speaking divine revelation, and he casually drops the name of this night creature as if she's part of the natural order. not as something to be explained or defended, but as something that simply is. This tells us that by the time of Isaiah, roughly 700 years before the birth of Christ, Lilith had already become deeply embedded in Hebrew consciousness. The word itself, Lili, carries within it the echo of night, the whisper of darkness, the suggestion of things that move in the shadows when decent people are asleep. Scholars tell us it's connected to the Hebrew word for night, Layla, but they also trace it back to those ancient Akkadian demons we encountered in Mesopotamia. Here we see the bridge between the Babylonian Lilith and the Hebrew Lilith, a linguistic and cultural transformation that spans centuries and civilizations. But why does Lilith appear in this particular context? Why does Isaiah place her in the ruins of Edom, among the creatures of desolation and judgment? The answer reveals something profound about how the ancient Hebrew mind understood the relationship between civilization and chaos, between the ordered world of God's people and the wild spaces where demons dwell. Edom, you see, wasn't just any kingdom. It was a nation that had consistently opposed Israel, that had rejoiced in Jerusalem's suffering, that had aligned itself against God's chosen people. In pronouncing judgment upon Edom, Isaiah is describing not just political destruction, but cosmic reversal. The places where humans once lived and thrived will become the dwelling places of creatures that represent everything humans fear. And at the center of this reversal, finding her perfect resting place in the ruins of civilization, is Lilith. She represents the return of primordial chaos, the moment when all human pretensions to order and control are stripped away. She is the creature who emerges when the protective barriers of society crumble, when the night reclaims what the day had built. This biblical appearance of Lilith reveals something crucial about her evolving legend. She's not yet Adam's first wife, not yet the rebellious partner who defied divine authority. She's something more elemental, more primal. She's the embodiment of the untamed feminine principle that exists outside the boundaries of civilization, that thrives in the spaces where human control breaks down. The prophet's use of Lilith in this context also suggests something about the nature of divine judgment itself. When God pronounces judgment on a nation, He doesn't simply destroy it and leave emptiness. Instead, He allows it to be filled with the very forces that civilization was created to hold back. The demons that once lurked at the edges of society now claim the centers of power. The creatures that once haunted the wilderness now nest in the ruins of palaces. And Lilith, finding her resting place in this desolation, becomes a symbol of what happens when the divine order is rejected. She represents the consequence of choosing rebellion over submission, chaos over order, the wild over the tame. But notice, she's not portrayed as an active agent of destruction. She doesn't come to attack or to conquer. She simply finds her place in the ruins left by divine judgment. This biblical portrait of Lilith is both more and less than what many people expect. It's more because it places her directly in the context of divine revelation, making her part of the sacred narrative of God's relationship with humanity. It's less because it offers no explanation of her origins, no story of her rebellion, no account of her transformation from woman to demon. But perhaps that's exactly the point. The Bible's treatment of Lilith is almost like a window into a vast library of stories that we can no longer read. She appears with the weight of centuries of folklore behind her, carrying the accumulated fears and fascinations of countless generations. The very fact that Isaiah can mention her without explanation suggests that there were rich traditions about her that have been lost to time. This raises a profound question that echoes through the centuries. What stories were the ancient Hebrews telling about Lilith that didn't make it into the Bible? What legends were so well known that they needed no explanation, yet so dangerous or controversial that they weren't included in the sacred text? The silence of Scripture around Lilith's origins and nature creates a vacuum that will be filled by centuries of speculation, elaboration, and myth-making. The single verse in Isaiah becomes the seed from which will grow an entire literature of Lilith legends, each generation adding new details, new interpretations, new significance to this mysterious figure. But here's what we must understand. The biblical Lilith is not the domesticated demon of later folklore. She's not the jealous ex-wife seeking revenge on Eve's children. She's something far more cosmic, far more fundamental. She's the principle of chaos that exists at the very foundations of creation. The reminder that beneath all human civilization lies the wilderness that can never be fully tamed. The Hebrew word Lilith appears only once in the entire Bible, but that single appearance carries the weight of millennia. It connects the ancient fears of Mesopotamian night demons to the divine judgment of Hebrew prophecy. It bridges the gap between pagan mythology and sacred revelation. And it establishes Lilith as a figure who exists at the very boundaries of the sacred and the profane, the ordered and the chaotic, the known and the unknowable. As we prepare to follow Lilith's journey from this biblical appearance into the elaborate mythologies of later centuries, we must remember that we're not just tracing the evolution of a legend. We're exploring the deepest questions about the nature of existence itself. What happens when the ordered world breaks down? What forces wait in the shadows to reclaim what civilization has built? And what does it mean that these forces are often portrayed as feminine, as representing aspects of womanhood that refuse to be contained within the boundaries of patriarchal society? The stage is set for one of the most dramatic transformations in the history of human storytelling. The biblical Lilith, dwelling in the ruins of Edom, is about to become something that would astonish even the prophet Isaiah himself. She's about to step out of the shadows of divine judgment and into the very heart of creation itself, where she will challenge not just human authority, but the divine order of the universe. Are you ready to witness how a single verse of Hebrew prophecy becomes the foundation for one of the most controversial stories ever told about the origins of humanity? Are you prepared to see how silence becomes the canvas for the most audacious rewriting of Genesis ever attempted? Then hold on tight, because we're about to enter the medieval world of Jewish mysticism, where scribes and scholars will dare to ask the ultimate question: what if there was another woman in the Garden of Eden? What if Eve wasn't the first? The year is approximately 900 CE, and somewhere in the scholarly circles of medieval Judaism, an anonymous scribe sits hunched over parchment, quill in hand, about to commit one of the most audacious acts of theological rebellion in human history. He is crafting a text that will be known as the Alphabet of Ben Sira, and within its pages, he is about to transform our mysterious Lilith from a creature of desolation into the first woman who ever drew breath on earth. But here's what will astound you. This wasn't presented as theology. This wasn't offered as serious biblical commentary. Many scholars believe this text was actually a work of biting satire, a literary bomb thrown at the religious establishment of its time. The author was taking aim at the rabbinic interpretations that had dominated Jewish thought for centuries, and he chose to do it by telling the most shocking story imaginable about the origins of humanity itself. Picture the scene as this medieval writer begins to weave his tale. He starts with a question that had puzzled biblical scholars for generations. Why does the book of Genesis seem to tell the story of creation twice? In the first chapter, God creates mankind, male and female, in his image. But in the second chapter, God forms Adam from dust and then creates Eve from his rib. Were these two separate events? Two different accounts of the same creation? Or was there something more? The author of the Alphabet of Ben Sira dared to suggest the unthinkable. What if Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 were describing different women entirely? What if the woman created alongside Adam in chapter 1 was not Eve, but someone else entirely? What if her name was Lilith? And so begins one of the most controversial origin stories ever told. According to this medieval text, when God first created Adam, he saw that it was not good for man to be alone. So God created a woman from the earth, just as he had created Adam, making them equals in every way. Her name was Lilith, and she was beautiful, intelligent, and possessed of a will that matched Adam's own. But here's where the story takes a turn that would shock ancient audiences and continues to provoke debate today. Adam and Lilith, this first couple found themselves in immediate conflict. Not over profound theological questions, not over the nature of good and evil, but over something far more intimate and symbolic, the question of who would be on top during their physical union. Adam, asserting what he believed to be his natural authority, insisted that Lilith should lie beneath him. But Lilith, created from the same earth as Adam, possessing the same divine breath, refused to accept a subordinate position. "I will not lie below you," she declared, "for we are equal, both of us created from the same earth." Can you imagine the revolutionary nature of this statement? In a world where women were considered property, where female submission was seen as natural law, where the very order of creation was believed to establish male dominance, here was a woman claiming absolute equality with the first man. Not just spiritual equality, but physical equality, social equality, the equality of two beings created by the same divine hand from the same divine substance. The argument escalated, and according to the text, Lilith did something that no human had ever done before. She spoke the ineffable name of God. This wasn't just any name, but the sacred tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of the divine that was considered too holy to utter. In speaking this name, Lilith was claiming direct access to divine power, bypassing Adam's supposed authority entirely. And then she did something even more shocking. She flew away. Picture this moment. The first woman, created by God's own hand, choosing exile over submission, choosing the unknown wilderness over the security of Eden, choosing freedom over the comfort of companionship. She spread wings that no biblical text had ever mentioned and took to the air, leaving behind the first man and the garden paradise for the wild, untamed spaces of the earth. Adam, suddenly alone, did what humans have done ever since when faced with the consequences of their actions. He complained to God. "Master of the universe," he cried, "the woman you gave me has fled from me." Notice the language here. He doesn't say, "My wife has left me," or "Lilith has abandoned me." He says, "The woman you gave me," placing the responsibility for this crisis squarely on God's shoulders. God's response was swift and decisive. He dispatched 3 angels with names that sound like incantations themselves: Sanoi, Sansonoi, and Samangaloth. These divine messengers were given a clear mission: find Lilith and bring her back to Eden, or else ensure that she faced the consequences of her rebellion. The angels found Lilith by the Red Sea, a location that's deeply symbolic in Jewish tradition. This is the same sea that God would later part for the Israelites, the boundary between slavery and freedom, between the known and the unknown. Here, in this liminal space between worlds, Lilith had made her home. When the angels delivered God's ultimatum, Lilith's response revealed the true cost of her rebellion. She would not return to Eden, she declared, but she would accept a terrible punishment. If she insisted on her independence, then 100 of her children would die every day. She would become the mother of demons, creatures doomed to brief existence, forever dying and being reborn in an endless cycle of mortality. But even this cosmic punishment came with a caveat that reveals something profound about the nature of divine mercy. Lilith agreed that she would not harm any child who was protected by an amulet, bearing the names or images of the 3 angels. In other words, even in her rebellion, even in her transformation from woman to demon, there remained a path to protection, a way for humans to shield themselves from her influence. This is where the story becomes both deeply disturbing and strangely beautiful. Lilith, denied the possibility of having human children, became the mother of demons. But these weren't mindless monsters. According to the legend, she would seduce sleeping men, using their seed to create offspring that inherited both her supernatural nature and her tragic fate. She became the explanation for nocturnal emissions, for the erotic dreams that visited men in their sleep, for the mysterious ways that desire could overwhelm even the most pious. But her greatest sorrow, and perhaps her greatest source of fury, was her relationship with human children. Unable to bear and raise children of her own, She was driven to steal the infants of others. The text describes her as particularly dangerous to newborn boys for 8 days after birth, until their circumcision brought them fully into the covenant community. Girls were at risk for 20 days, a period that corresponded to ancient beliefs about when a child's soul was fully settled in its body. This aspect of the Lilith legend speaks to one of humanity's deepest fears, the death of children. In an age when infant mortality was tragically common, when mothers lived in constant fear of losing their babies to disease, accident, or mysterious causes, Lilith became the personification of that terror. She was the answer to the question that every grieving parent asked, "Why did my child die?" But here's what makes the story so complex, so psychologically rich. Lilith wasn't portrayed as evil for the sake of being evil. She was tragic. She was a woman who chose freedom over security, who preferred the unknown to submission, who accepted cosmic punishment rather than compromise her sense of equality. Her transformation into a demon wasn't presented as a moral failing, but as the inevitable consequence of refusing to accept the established order. The medieval author who crafted this story was doing something revolutionary. He was suggesting that the patriarchal order of his society wasn't natural or inevitable, but was the result of one woman's choice to submit and another's choice to rebel. Eve accepted her place in the established hierarchy, but Lilith chose exile. Eve became the mother of humanity, but Lilith became the mother of everything that threatens human order. This Alphabet of Ben Sira wasn't just telling a story about the distant past. It was making a statement about the present. It was suggesting that for every woman who accepts her assigned role, there's another who chooses the wilderness. For every Eve who says yes to the established order, there's a Lilith who says no, who chooses freedom over security, who accepts punishment rather than submission. But here's the crucial detail that many people miss. This text wasn't accepted as authentic scripture. The Jewish religious establishment largely rejected it, seeing it as satirical, heretical, or simply too dangerous to take seriously. The story of Lilith as Adam's first wife remained on the margins of Jewish thought, whispered about in secret, discussed in the shadows, but never fully embraced as religious truth. Yet the story refused to die. It was too powerful, too psychologically resonant, too perfectly suited to address the deepest questions about gender, power, and rebellion to simply disappear. Instead, it went underground, carried forward by folk traditions, by mothers warning their children about the dangers of the night, by scholars who found in it a key to understanding the complexities of human nature. The Alphabet of Ben Sira had planted a seed that would grow in the darkness, that would eventually bloom into one of the most controversial and influential myths in human history. The story of Lilith as Adam's first wife would evolve, would adapt, would transform itself to meet the needs of each generation. But it would never again be quite as raw, quite as shocking, quite as revolutionary as it was in that first medieval telling. What this anonymous scribe had done was nothing short of extraordinary. He had taken the mysterious figure from Isaiah's prophecy, the creature dwelling in the ruins of Edom, and transformed her into the first feminist, the first woman to demand equality, the first person to choose exile over submission. He had rewritten the story of creation itself, suggesting that the patriarchal order wasn't divinely ordained, but was the result of one woman's choice to submit and another's choice to rebel. The implications of this story would echo through the centuries, influencing everything from Jewish mysticism to modern feminism. But in that medieval moment, as the scribe set down his quill and looked at what he had written, he could have had no idea that he was creating a legend that would outlive empires, that would challenge religious authority, that would become a symbol of female empowerment for generations yet unborn. The woman who had begun as a Mesopotamian demon, who had appeared briefly in Hebrew prophecy, was now poised to become something unprecedented, the first woman to say no to God's plan, the first person to choose freedom over paradise, the first rebel in the garden of creation itself. But the story doesn't end in the medieval shadows. No, The legend of Lilith was about to undergo its most dramatic transformation yet, as Jewish mystics began to weave her into the very fabric of cosmic reality itself. The Kabbalah, that ancient system of Jewish mysticism that sought to understand the hidden workings of the divine, would take this rebellious first wife and transform her into something that would make even the boldest medieval storyteller gasp in amazement. Picture the candle-lit chambers of 13th century Spain, where Jewish scholars pored over ancient texts with the intensity of alchemists seeking to transmute base metal into gold. These weren't just religious scholars, they were spiritual archaeologists, digging through layers of meaning to uncover the secret architecture of creation itself. And in their explorations, they discovered something that would forever change how humanity understood the relationship between good and evil, order and chaos, the sacred and the profane. The Zohar, that masterpiece of Jewish mysticism, introduced a concept that would revolutionize the Lilith legend. According to these mystical teachings, Lilith wasn't just Adam's rebellious first wife. She was the divine consort of Samael, the angel of death himself, ruling over an entire realm of spiritual darkness that existed as a twisted mirror image of the divine order. But here's where the story becomes truly breathtaking in its scope and audacity. The Kabbalists taught that Lilith and Samael didn't just emerge from nowhere. They were emanations of the divine itself, born from the very throne of God as a consequence of humanity's first sin. When Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, they didn't just bring death into the world. They created an entire shadow universe ruled by the forces of spiritual rebellion. Imagine the cosmic implications of this teaching. Every act of disobedience, every moment of rebellion, every choice to turn away from the divine order was feeding power to the shadow realm where Lilith reigned as queen. She wasn't just a demon who stole children in the night. She was the mother of all spiritual opposition, the wellspring from which every form of rebellion against God's authority emerged. The medieval mystics painted her as a figure of terrifying beauty and power. She was said to have long flowing hair that could entangle the souls of men, eyes that could see through the veils between worlds, and a voice that could call forth legions of demons with a single word. But more than her physical attributes, it was her spiritual nature that made her truly formidable. She was intelligence without submission, beauty without restraint, power without accountability. These mystical texts describe her nocturnal visits to sleeping men, not just as physical seduction, but as spiritual corruption. She would appear in dreams, offering forbidden knowledge, promising power that came without the price of obedience. And from these unholy unions, she would birth not just demons, but entire philosophies of rebellion, entire systems of thought that challenged the established order of creation. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these medieval teachings was their explanation of why Lilith had such power over children. According to the Kabbalists, every child born into the world carried within them the spark of divine potential, the possibility of perfect obedience to God's will. Lilith, as the mother of rebellion, was driven to corrupt or destroy this potential before it could fully manifest. She wasn't just stealing children's lives, she was stealing their spiritual destiny. The protective amulets that mothers placed over their children's cradles weren't just folk superstitions. They were spiritual warfare, physical manifestations of the cosmic battle between the forces of divine order and the seductive power of rebellion. The names of the three angels, Sanoi, Sansanoi, and Samangaloth, weren't just words on parchment. They were incantations that could bind the very forces of chaos itself. And yet, even in these mystical teachings, there remained something almost sympathetic about Lilith's plight. She was portrayed not as mindlessly evil, but as tragically necessary. Her rebellion wasn't a flaw in creation, but an essential part of it. How could humanity truly choose obedience if rebellion wasn't a real option? How could love be genuine if it wasn't freely given? Lilith, in her cosmic defiance, made human choice meaningful by ensuring that the alternative to divine order was always present, always available, always whispering its seductive promises. The Kabbalistic Lilith was both more and less than human. She was the personification of every impulse that said no to authority, every desire that refused to be contained, every aspect of human nature that chafed against the boundaries of divine law. She was the shadow cast by the light of divine order, and like all shadows, she was inseparable from the very thing she opposed. But as these mystical teachings spread through Jewish communities across Europe, something unexpected began to happen. The story of Lilith began to change once again, this time not through the pens of scholars, but through the whispered conversations of mothers and grandmothers, through the folk traditions that carried ancient wisdom in forms that academia couldn't always understand. In the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, Lilith became less a cosmic figure and more a practical concern. She was the explanation for why babies died in their sleep, why women struggled with childbirth, why marriages sometimes failed despite the best intentions of both partners. But she was also the reason why mothers sang lullabies, why communities came together to protect their most vulnerable members, why the bonds between women grew stronger in the face of shared danger. The amulets and incantations that protected against Lilith weren't just individual protections. They were community statements, declarations that this group of people would stand together against the forces that threatened their children, their families, their future. In fighting Lilith, they were fighting for the very possibility of human continuity, for the hope that their children would grow up to carry on their traditions, their values, their understanding of what it meant to be human. But even as these folk traditions were developing, the intellectual world was beginning to question the very foundations of the Lilith legend. Scholars began to examine the Alphabet of Ben Sira more carefully, recognizing its satirical nature, understanding that it was never meant to be taken as literal truth. They traced the evolution of the story, following its path from Mesopotamian demons to Hebrew prophecy, to medieval mysticism, to folk tradition. And yet, despite this scholarly skepticism, the story of Lilith refused to fade away. If anything, it seemed to grow stronger with each generation, adapting itself to new circumstances, new concerns, new questions about the nature of human existence. The myth had taken on a life of its own, becoming something that transcended its origins, something that spoke to truths that couldn't be contained within the boundaries of historical accuracy or religious orthodoxy. By the time the medieval period was drawing to a close, Lilith had become something unprecedented in human mythology. She was simultaneously the first woman and the first demon, the mother of humanity and the mother of everything that threatened humanity, the symbol of equality and the embodiment of rebellion, the figure who made choice possible and the one who made choice dangerous. She was the question that every generation would have to answer for itself. What happens when someone says no to the established order? What happens when the price of freedom is exile? When the cost of equality is conflict? When the demand for respect leads to rebellion? Lilith had become the eternal what-if of human existence, the path not taken, the choice not made, the voice that whispered in the darkness, "It doesn't have to be this way." But the story was far from over. As the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance, as the Renaissance gave way to the Enlightenment, as the Enlightenment gave way to the modern world, Lilith would continue to evolve, continue to adapt, continue to challenge each generation to confront the deepest questions about power, gender, rebellion, and the price of freedom. The woman who had begun as a Mesopotamian night demon, who had appeared briefly in Hebrew prophecy, who had been transformed into Adam's first wife by a medieval satirist, who had been elevated to cosmic significance by Jewish mystics, was about to undergo her most radical transformation yet. She was about to become something that would have astonished all her previous incarnations. She was about to become a feminist icon, a symbol of female empowerment, a rallying cry for women who refused to accept the limitations that society had placed upon them. The ancient whisper in the darkness was about to become a roar that would shake the very foundations of patriarchal authority. The creature who had once been feared as a stealer of children was about to be celebrated as the first woman who dared to demand equality. The demon who had been blamed for every form of rebellion was about to be praised as the foremother of every movement for justice and freedom. But before we witness this final transformation, we must ask ourselves, what does it mean that humanity has carried this story forward through thousands of years of history? What does it tell us about ourselves that we've kept alive the memory of the woman who said no, who chose exile over submission, who preferred the wilderness to the constraints of civilization? Perhaps the answer lies not in the historical accuracy of the Lilith legend, but in its psychological truth. Perhaps we've kept this story alive because it speaks to something essential about the human condition, something that transcends the boundaries of culture, religion, and time. Perhaps Lilith represents not just the first woman who rebelled, but the eternal human capacity for rebellion itself, the spark within each of us that refuses to be completely tamed, completely controlled, completely contained. As we stand at the threshold of understanding how this ancient legend speaks to our modern world, we must remember that myths aren't just stories about the past. They're living narratives that continue to shape how we understand ourselves and our possibilities. The question isn't whether Lilith was real in the historical sense. The question is whether the truth she represents, the choices she embodies, the challenges she poses, are real enough to change how we think about power, equality, and the eternal human struggle between freedom and security. The ancient whisper is about to become a contemporary conversation. The medieval legend is about to meet the modern world. And in that meeting, we may discover that the most important question isn't who Lilith was, but who she can help us become. Are you ready to witness the final transformation of this eternal rebel? Are you prepared to see how an ancient demon becomes a modern symbol of empowerment? Then hold on, because we're about to discover that the story of Lilith isn't just about the past. It's about the present, the future, and the eternal human capacity to choose freedom over security, equality over submission, truth over comfort. The woman who flew away from Eden is about to land in the 21st century. And her arrival will challenge everything we think we know about rebellion, about equality, about the price of freedom, and about the courage it takes to say no to the established order. The ancient story is about to become a contemporary revolution. The 20th century arrived like a thunderclap, bringing with it technologies that would have seemed like magic to our ancestors, ideologies that would reshape the political landscape, and social movements that would challenge every assumption about human nature and human possibility. And in this cauldron of change, something extraordinary happened to our ancient rebel. Lilith, the woman who had been feared and reviled for millennia, was about to undergo the most radical transformation of her long and storied existence. Picture the year 1972, a time when the world was convulsing with social upheaval. The civil rights movement had challenged racial hierarchies. The anti-war movement had questioned military authority. And now a new force was emerging that would shake the very foundations of gender relations. The feminist movement wasn't just asking for equal pay or voting rights. It was demanding a fundamental reconsideration of what it meant to be human in a world that had been shaped by thousands of years of patriarchal assumption. It was in this moment of historical transformation that a writer named Lily Rivlin sat down to pen an article for Ms. Magazine, the groundbreaking feminist publication that was giving voice to women's experiences in ways that had never been possible before. But Rivlin wasn't writing about contemporary politics or modern social issues. She was reaching back through the centuries to reclaim a figure who had been vilified, demonized, and feared. She was writing about Lilith. But this wasn't the Lilith of ancient demonology or medieval mysticism. This was Lilith reborn, Lilith reclaimed, Lilith transformed from demon to hero, from cautionary tale to inspiration. Rivlin looked at the story of Adam's first wife and saw not a warning about the dangers of female rebellion, but a celebration of the first woman who had demanded equality, who had refused to accept a subordinate position, who had chosen exile over submission. Can you imagine the audacity of this reinterpretation? For thousands of years, Lilith had been the boogeyman of patriarchal society, The cautionary tale told to warn women about the consequences of challenging male authority. She had been the demon who stole children, the seductress who corrupted men, the embodiment of everything that happened when women refused to stay in their assigned places. But Rivlin and the feminist writers who followed her saw something entirely different. They saw a woman who had been created as Adam's equal, who had demanded to be treated as his equal, and who had been demonized by a patriarchal society that couldn't tolerate the idea of female equality. They saw the first feminist, the first woman to say, "I will not lie below," the first person to choose freedom over security. This reinterpretation wasn't just academic. It was revolutionary. It suggested that the entire Western tradition of female subordination wasn't natural or divinely ordained, but was the result of a cosmic injustice that had been perpetuated for millennia. If Lilith had been Adam's equal in the beginning, if she had been created from the same earth and breathed with the same divine breath, then the subordination of women wasn't part of God's plan, but a violation of it. The feminist reclamation of Lilith reached its pinnacle in 1976 with the founding of Lilith magazine, a publication that took her name with pride and purpose. The magazine's founders weren't just borrowing an ancient name. They were making a statement about their identity and their mission. They were saying that they, like Lilith, would not lie below, would not accept subordination, would not be silenced or marginalized. But here's what makes this transformation so remarkable. The feminist interpretation of Lilith wasn't just a modern invention imposed on an ancient story. It was a recognition of elements that had been present in the legend all along. The story of Lilith as Adam's first wife had always contained the seeds of equality, the demand for respect, the refusal to accept subordination. What the feminist movement did was to change the moral framework through which these elements were interpreted. Where previous generations had seen rebellion and chaos, feminists saw justice and liberation. Where ancient authors had seen the dangerous consequences of female autonomy, modern women saw the beautiful possibilities of female empowerment. Where traditional interpretations had focused on Lilith's punishment and exile, contemporary readings emphasize her courage and independence. This wasn't just a matter of changing perspectives. It was a fundamental reimagining of what it meant to be human. The feminist reclamation of Lilith suggested that the capacity for rebellion, for independence, for refusing to accept unjust authority, wasn't a flaw in human nature, but one of its greatest strengths. It implied that the women who had been labeled as difficult, as rebellious, as unwilling to accept their place, weren't deviant but were following in the footsteps of the first woman who had ever demanded equality. But the transformation of Lilith didn't stop with academic articles and feminist magazines. She began to appear in art, literature, music, and popular culture in ways that would have astonished her ancient creators. She became a symbol of female empowerment that transcended religious boundaries, cultural differences, and historical periods. She was the patron saint of every woman who had ever said no to a man who expected automatic obedience, every woman who had chosen career over marriage, every woman who had refused to be defined by her relationship to men. The Lilith Fair, the all-female music festival that toured America in the late 1990s, wasn't just a concert series. It was a cultural phenomenon that brought together women artists who had often been marginalized by the male-dominated music industry. The festival's name wasn't chosen randomly. It was a deliberate invocation of the woman who had refused to be subordinated, who had demanded equality, who had chosen exile over submission. But even as Lilith was being celebrated as a feminist icon, her story continued to evolve and adapt to new circumstances. Contemporary writers began to explore the psychological dimensions of her legend, seeing in her not just a symbol of female empowerment, but a representation of the human struggle with authority, with conformity, with the pressure to accept roles that don't fit who we really are. Modern interpretations of Lilith began to emphasize not just her rebellion, but her loneliness. Not just her strength, but her isolation. Not just her independence, but the price she paid for it. She became a complex figure who embodied both the possibilities and the costs of choosing freedom over security, equality over comfort, authenticity over acceptance. This psychological reading of Lilith resonated with a generation that was struggling with questions of identity, authenticity, and the courage to live according to their own values rather than society's expectations. She became a symbol for everyone who had ever felt like an outsider, everyone who had ever paid a price for refusing to conform, everyone who had ever chosen the difficult path of being true to themselves rather than the easy path of fitting in. But here's the crucial question that emerges from this contemporary transformation. Is the feminist reclamation of Lilith historically accurate? Does it represent a return to the original meaning of her story? Or is it a modern invention that imposes contemporary values on ancient narratives? The answer, like Lilith herself, is complex and multifaceted. On one hand, the feminist interpretation does highlight elements that were present in the original stories. The Alphabet of Ben Sira, despite its satirical nature, does portray Lilith as demanding equality with Adam. The ancient texts do present her as choosing exile over submission, independence over security. On the other hand, the feminist reading necessarily downplays or ignores elements of the traditional story that don't fit contemporary values. The Lilith of ancient legend was genuinely dangerous, genuinely destructive, genuinely opposed to the order that allowed human civilization to function. She wasn't just a misunderstood woman seeking equality. She was a cosmic force of chaos that threatened the very foundations of human society. But perhaps the question of historical accuracy misses the point. Myths aren't just stories about the past. They're living narratives that each generation reinterprets to address its own concerns, its own challenges, its own questions about what it means to be human. The feminist reclamation of Lilith isn't just about understanding an ancient legend. It's about creating meaning for contemporary life. And in that process of meaning-making, something profound has happened. The figure who was once the ultimate cautionary tale about female rebellion has become the ultimate inspiration for female empowerment. The demon who was feared for her refusal to submit has become the hero celebrated for her demand for equality. The woman who was exiled from paradise has become the guide for those seeking to create their own paradise on earth. This transformation reveals something essential about the power of storytelling, about the way narratives shape not just how we understand the past, but how we imagine the future. The story of Lilith has become a mirror in which each generation sees its own struggles, its own values, its own understanding of what it means to be human. But the story isn't over. Even as we speak, new interpretations of Lilith are emerging, new ways of understanding her significance, new applications of her legend to contemporary concerns. She has become a figure who transcends the boundaries of any single interpretation, any single culture, any single time period. She is simultaneously the ancient demon and the modern feminist, the cautionary tale and the inspiration, the symbol of dangerous rebellion and the embodiment of necessary resistance. She is the woman who said no when yes was expected, who chose freedom when submission was demanded, who preferred the wilderness to the constraints of civilization. And in that choice, in that refusal, in that willingness to pay the price for authenticity, she has become something more than a character in an ancient story. She has become a possibility, a reminder that the established order is not inevitable, that authority is not absolute, that the courage to say no can be the first step toward creating something better. The question that remains is not whether Lilith was real in the historical sense. The question is whether the truth she represents, the choices she embodies, the courage she demonstrates, are real enough to change how we think about ourselves and our possibilities. The ancient whisper has become a contemporary conversation, and that conversation is far from over. In the end, perhaps the most important truth about Lilith is not who she was, but who she helps us become. She is the eternal reminder that we have choices, that we can say no to what diminishes us, That we can choose freedom over security, equality over subordination, authenticity over acceptance. She's the woman who flew away from paradise, because she understood that a paradise built on inequality is no paradise at all. The ancient rebel continues to inspire modern revolutions. The first woman to demand equality continues to guide contemporary struggles for justice. The voice that whispered in the darkness continues to speak to anyone who has ever felt the courage to challenge the established order, to demand better, to choose the difficult path of freedom over the easy path of submission. Lilith lives not as a historical figure, but as a living symbol of the human capacity for rebellion, for resistance, for the refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. She is the eternal what if that keeps hope alive, the voice that whispers in every generation, "It doesn't have to be this way. You can choose differently. You can say no. You can fly away." And in that flight, in that refusal, in that courage to choose freedom over security, we find not just the story of Lilith, but the story of every human being who has ever dared to dream of a better world, and had the courage to take the first step toward making it real. The ancient legend has become a contemporary call to action, and the echo of that call continues to resonate through the corridors of time, challenging each of us to decide, will we lie below, or will we choose to fly?